My name is Bill Manning. I was born in Lewiston in 1936 and came to Portland in 1954 to the art school, which was called the Portland School of Art, affiliated under the umbrella of the Portland Museum of Art. It was small. It was in the Greek Revival building behind the museum that's there now. Uh, and we had probably about 20 students. And there were 4 instructors. And we used to have classes in the museum downstairs in the basement, in the old museum, not the new museum. And it was interesting because before I went there in '54, right after the war, the veterans, the soldiers, or whoever they were, veterans, could go to the art school. And most of them joined the art schools simply because they could get a certain amount of money, but they never went to classes. But when they did, it was just overloaded. The school itself was loaded, and the whole downstairs of the museum was loaded with students. It was very strange. But when I went, that was gone, and it was just 20 students. And we had very personal instruction. I mean, there was no big classes or anything. And I stayed there as a student for 5 years. And then in the 10th year, at that period of time, the state would pay full tuition to any college or university or any kind of school after high school. They would pay for that if you were handicapped. And of course I had polio at the time when I was 8 years old. And so I was able to get the state to pay the tuition to go to school there. You had to go to school in the state. You could not go to school out of the state. So they paid the tuition, and at the end of 5 years, they asked, I became a student teacher and for 1 year, and then I left. I graduated and went to New York to see if I would stay in New York. That's where everybody, all the painters went. I wanted to be a painter. I wanted to be many things. I first started off in the commercial field. My father and mother asked me what I wanted to do. They never interfered with my education. They never told me what to do. They just left it up to me, which was very good of parents. Parents usually want to direct their children what to do. And I said, well, I can't think of anything I can do because of the polio, is to be an artist, because that's what I used to do when I was in the hospital. I spent about 2 years in the hospital with the polio, and I used to do all the comic strip things, and all the nurses wanted them and so forth. So now when I got older, I figured, well, I'd be a commercial artist. And I started taking that for a while, and I realized I don't want to be a commercial artist. I want to be this. So I went for that, something else, another course, different course, graphic course. And then I didn't want to do a graphic art. And so I landed up wanting to be a painter. And I went to New York. I stayed there for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. I'm not really sure. I can't remember. And I was asked to come back to teach at the art school. So I came back and I taught there for about 10 years. And then there were much more students then, and it became, there was conflict philosophically between 3 instructors and the director and the other instructors. There were about 7 or 8 instructors then. And I got fired as being a radical after being 10 years. But that period of time, that was going on through the whole country. There was these wavelengths like going through art schools, all kinds of schools were having trouble with the students wanting to have more freedom in working, and we wanted the art school not to be so restricted that you had to have a certain thing in 1 year and then a certain thing in the second year. And what it was a plan that you had to go 4 years before you got your diploma. So it was, in other words, to make money. I mean, they wouldn't let you paint in the first year. They'd allow you to paint in the fourth year or at the end of the third year, but you couldn't paint in the first year, which we thought, and I thought, there were three of us, was a little ridiculous. Because if you studied a certain particular thing like color, and you just studied color alone, but you didn't apply it to anything, and then in the fourth year you're supposed to apply color to a painting, you didn't know how to do it because you couldn't remember what you did in the first year. So we wanted to open it up so that they could paint and so forth. So we were called radicals, and we were fired, and I was co-founder along with the other two teachers that got fired with me, and the director of the Portland Museum resigned because I got fired, and the rest of the staff resigned, and the only thing that was left was the janitor. And we founded a school called Concept. And Concept was on Congress Street, and we had about 10 or 15 students, and they came from the really high academic colleges, Harvard, Yale, all of these, and we were there for, the school lasted 5 years, and it dissolved, and I got a grant in the fifth year, a National Endowment grant, and I was able to paint. So I was the first person to paint abstractly. When I say first person, first native person of state of Maine. Marsden Hartley, at the end of his career in 1917, end of his modern career in about 1917, did a few abstract works. And then he came to Maine and changed completely and started doing landscape paintings, which are incredibly, I'm not criticizing them, they're incredibly powerful paintings. They're good paintings. And I don't think he could have ever been able to do them if he didn't go through his first period while he was in Germany and being affected by the Cubists and so forth. And he did some incredible Maine paintings. But I went in a different direction and painted completely abstractly for, well, I had a McDowell Fellowship in 65, I don't know. So I went to Mexico for a while, for a very short period of time. We both went to Mexico. And Mexico color affected me. You started to use a lot of blue because the skies there was no pollution down there then. And the skies, and the car we had couldn't go any faster than 35 miles an hour when we got up to the top into Mexico City. You couldn't, and the butterflies were all blue, and so it changed my style to a degree that I was still painting a little representationally, and so the blues, the skies were bluer than they were here, and so forth. Now, my philosophy of painting is I was the first person to paint abstractly, but actually I consider myself a representational painter. And I consider the people who paint representationally abstract painters. Now, I've been fighting this system for a long time, And some of the people that write about art have finally come along to understand what I'm talking about. The representational painter that we call, unfortunately, we have to talk about painting when you can't, it's not a verbal means of communication, it's a visual. But we do have to talk about it. So the representational painter, which I said there weren't many painters like there are today in the state. We're loaded with them. They're everywhere. And this is all because of the educational system. The reason I said they're representational is because let's put it this way. They take a canvas, we'll say that's 16 inches by 24 inches, and they put it on an easel, all right? And then they look out into and they're looking at a 2-mile space out there with houses and trees and everything you can possibly imagine. Now they're going to put that on a 16 by 24 inch piece of canvas? That's impossible. So they are painting what they like to see more than what they like to see, not feel, but what they like to see. So you can't paint every leaf, and you can't paint every clapboard on the house, and you can't paint. So they minimize it, and so what they do is they abstract it. Okay? That part, you probably understand. The abstract part is, let's say I look at that, like Monhegan. They go out there with their canvases, and they're covering half the island. It's got 2 big, huge heads of rock, boulders, big like a mountain, 100 and some odd feet high, and they're putting them on a small thing like this. And they have certain feelings about it as well. I'm not saying they don't have feelings about it. Edward Hopper did some great paintings of Monhegan. And I went out there and studied the structure of this more than the outer look of it, and felt what it was like to be on a island and listen to the wind at night and listen and seeing the sunsets and all that sort of stuff and the colors and all that. And so when I paint abstractly, I am painting myself. I have my own language, hoping that this language that I have, and somebody looks at it, will try to, instead of looking, seeing is the important thing. In other words, you just don't, if you go to a museum if you go to the Museum of Modern Art and you go to the abstract expressionist area where all the great American painters broke away from Paris, you sit there and you watch the people, and I think the time span of looking at a painting is like 2 or 3 seconds. I don't think it's even more than that. Now that's just looking. Seeing a painting is standing there or sitting there and really studying the painting and trying to find out what the painter was trying to say and also what they were trying to say. In other words, a painting becomes a mirror, much of it, of themselves. And they can learn a lot about themselves as we're learning about a little bit about what the painting is all about. Now that is even true about representational painting. If you go back to all the great representational painters, you really don't know why there are why is that dog on the bottom of the feet of that person, and why is this over here? The artist has his own reason for doing that. And you got, so you have the same problems looking at a representational painting as you do an abstract painting, but they don't do that. When I used to go to museums, I would go to the 12th century and look at that a lot, as well as the modern. After going to New York and see it was done, I was shocked. I was literally shocked at what I was looking at. I thought, well, what is this? Is it junk or is it really painting? I mean, I just didn't go in and say, wow, isn't this tremendous? And come back and paint abstractly. So I was sort of a representational painter in the beginning because I was studying under representational painters. I was studying under Jim Elliott and Lawrence Sisson and Jack Minch and people like that. So I was basically a representational painter. And then I started to change because I wanted to paint what I felt more about the works, not what I saw in the work, in the landscape. And so my painting became semi-abstract. In other words, you could look at it and you could say, those are trees, that's a hill, that's a cavernous area on Monhegan that you can stand on top of a ledge and look down into the water. You could tell that sort of thing. Yet it was not representational where you saw every crack in the rock. So that gives you an idea of what I mean by abstract and representational. Okay, so then I got to paint abstractly. In other words, you could sense power or strength that Monhegan had. You could sense it by looking at it, but not see it as, say, oh, that's a nice rock. That's a big boulder, or that's a, you could say, oh, that's a huge wave coming in. You could sense the energy, the feeling that Monhegan had. And and then in the beginning of the 80s, I don't know why, I can't pinpoint certain things. Things happen, like things happen in painting that I can't tell you why they're there. And then things happen in painting because the painting dictates to you what to do. You're going to do a certain color, and the next thing you know, you're taking up a color that's not the color you wanted the color to paint with. And you realize that the painting is telling you what to do. And sometimes the painting's wrong, and they're telling you wrong, and sometimes they're telling you right. But I began thinking, and every time I looked out, I began thinking, why am I painting flat, on a flat canvas? You don't see flat. You see three-dimensionally. So in the beginning of the 80s, I was in the studio, and I was working on a flat surface. And I had a miter box, and I was cutting a frame for the painting. Now, a miter box, a lot of people don't know what they are, but at that time, they were made of wood. They were about a foot long, maybe a little longer, and they had diagonal cuts in them where you could cut a 45 degree. You put a piece of wood. There were 3 pieces of wood, a bottom one and 2 on the sides, and the top ones were cut at certain angles, and you could put a saw inside that cut and put a piece of wood in there and saw away, and you could get a 45 cut and put them together. Well, I used to make frames, and I was painting on a flat surface, and then I went over and I cut a piece of wood, and I just accidentally took the piece of wood and just put it down, but I happened to be putting it down, instead of laying down flat, I had to put it down standing up. And I went over back to my painting, and I was painting away and so forth on, and I stopped, and I stopped for a while, and I turned around and I looked at the miter box, and I said to myself, that's the way we see. So I took the miter box and I painted all around it and inside of it, which is difficult to do. And I painted inside of it. For 25 years, I painted nothing but three-dimensional paintings. And I painted just rectilinear shapes. I couldn't. Well, first of all, to go back to 1972 is when I started to break away from having images that were recognizable. I had used 3 colors: yellow, black, and white. Occasionally I would put in a little red or something like that, but and I did big abstract paintings. And then I had the grant, and I was doing 16-foot paintings, huge paintings. And then I turned to doing diamond paintings. And I would connect the points together like this, and they made a space, and so forth and so on. And then from that space, I started to do, I was very involved with the square. The square is a man-made form. You don't, probably some scientists or someone has already found out that, yeah, there is a square in nature, but the square itself is as far as I'm concerned, is a man-made form. The rectilinear is not, but the square is. And I got very involved with the square. The square in my paintings became humanity, man. And then the square, over all these years, morphed. When I got into the 3-dimensional works, I realized I couldn't do a square like the little painting that's behind you. Those are squares. But I really couldn't do big, huge square pieces. I couldn't pick them up. So I had to do rectilinear pieces. And I did the only time I ever did drawings of my work, I never did preliminary drawings. I did a drawing of the structure that I wanted, and then I would have it cut, and then I would paint over it and nail it together or screw it together, and then paint on it and use collage. I would take 75 pieces of paper, 20 some odd inches by 30 inches, and I would do abstract expressionistic painting on them. And my wife would help me, and we'd put them out on the floor to dry. And then after they were all dry, I would tear them all up. And then I did that, like, for example, Jasper Johns painted targets, numbers, stuff like that. So he didn't have to think of what to paint. He just wanted to paint. So he had the number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. He did that. Mine were brushstrokes. It saved me from saying, I'm going to put this big, huge brushstroke here. I would look through my painted, torn papers and got the right shape and the right brushstroke that I wanted, and I would glue that to the surface. And I would glue, these were glued to squares, and then the squares were glued onto the board. But I would glue the paper right onto the surface. And that wasn't done very much. The collage was a Picasso and Braque invention. And I don't know of many people who painted and then just took the brushstroke and glued it on. And that's what I did for 25 years until I physically, the post-polio syndrome got to me that I physically could not do them anymore. And that one that you see there is probably the last one. And I did it myself. I don't know how I did it, but it took 2 people to put it together when I moved here. And we moved here, we built this house 14 years ago. I think that right, Barbara? Yes. 14 years ago. And I had a studio made, and I didn't know what I was going to do. And I figured, painting is, as far as I was concerned, was gone, dead. I couldn't do. Why did I have a studio made? I couldn't do the three-dimensional paintings anymore, physically. And then I started looking at the three-dimensional paintings, and I kept saying, you know, I can take something out of the three-dimensional paintings and go back to the flat surface. So I did 13 years ago. I stopped one whole year and didn't paint, and I went back 13 years ago to the flat surface, and been painting ever since. Yes, I've been painting, I figured it out the other day, 55 years, almost 60, really. That's a long time. The reason I stayed in Maine was good and was bad. It's like yin and yang, you know. When I went to New York, I went there to really live, to stay. And then I was asked to come back to teach. So I did that. And then I met some well-known artists on Monhegan, and I met Anita Sapolsky, and she saw my work, and she asked me to join the gallery. So I got into the New York scene when I was 50 years old. And if I'd have stayed in New York, I think I could have become incredibly well known. And I think my paintings probably would be going for 800 or 900,000 or something of that nature. But I wouldn't be painting what I'm painting. I think New York I would have fallen in with the, I don't know what you call them, but every once in a while, every 10 years, there's a new little thing going on, and I would have probably fallen into one of them. And I knew if I stayed in Maine, I could paint what I wanted to paint, not what other people wanted me to paint. All the museum in the States own my work. The Portland Museum owned, I think, about 70. The Farnsworth owned about 8 or 9. University of Maine owns some. Bates College owns about 110. And the reason that is because of Marsden Hartley. They have never come out, the curator's never come out and said that, but by his implications of the way he was talking and what he has done and so forth, they're comparing me as in the modern field as important as Marsden Hartley was in his modern field. And so they have 110 works. They don't have very many Marsden Hartley work. I don't think they have maybe one or two, but mostly is photographs and stuff like that. And the Lewiston Library, seeing I was born in Lewiston, I always thought they had a Marsden Hartley. Marsden Hartley gave him a painting in 1906. And I would go up and take care of my mother every 2 weeks. She was in her 80s. And I'd go up and do her shopping for her. And I would go and she read. And I would go to the library, and I would get the books for her and bring them. And I'd see this Marsden Hartley painting, and it was hung over not a fireplace, over a radiator. And the damn thing was dark. I mean, you could hardly see it. And it was stupid. Why did they have it over a radiator? But I always would look at this Marsden Hartley. It didn't, you know, it didn't. If you saw it, you would never say that was a Marsden Hartley. But it was a beautiful, beautiful landscape. And I always thought, you know, I'd like to give a painting to the Lewiston Library. But the Lewiston Library doesn't collect paintings. They just had this Marsden Hartley. So the curator at Bates said, I know the director of Hartley, of the Lewiston Library, and I'm going to talk to them. So there is a section, I don't know why it's called Marsden Hartley something or other. They don't have his painting in that section, but there's, I don't know, part of the building, a part of the thing is called the Marsden Hartley something or other. Can't remember. And he said, I think they would like to have one of yours. I told them all about you and so forth. So I called the Lewiston Library up and I said who I was, and he said, yes, right away. We'd like to have a painting. He says, we don't collect paintings. We don't have paintings. We have a Marsden Hartley, and they have the Robert, is it Robert? Yeah, Robert Indiana poster on Marsden Hartley. And that's the only thing. We do not collect paintings, but we want one of yours to go along. So they have a 1972 huge painting. And they had a small opening and a restaurant gathering and all that sort of stuff. So it was kind of fun. So I am in the library, which it's meaningful for me to be along with Marsden Hartley. And it's kind of interesting. But that's why I stayed in Maine all the time, because I know that I would have, and I think of that sometimes. I think, gee whiz, I probably would be living in I'd have a big studio and all that, and then no, I have a small studio, and but I'm doing what I want to do.